The judge will be speaking more loudly than everybody else today. I think that the only point that I would like to begin by emphasizing is that whatever happens here today, it will have no impact on ultimately what matters most to Chris Brann, which is getting his son back. It won't matter whether they get a short sentence, a long sentence, or no sentence at all. But today is important because what happens today will ultimately send a very clear message about what the United States thinks about parental child abduction and whether or not it is going to be taken seriously or not. There are thousands of other left behind parents like Chris Brann across the United States, and David Goldman will speak to this as well. And a strong sentence today will send a very clear message that parental child abduction cannot be tolerated, and it will be a shot in the arm of hope for so many thousands of other left behind parents who are struggling, often in silence and in enormous anguish, to bring their own children back home. Chris.
Thank you. You know, this has always been about me trying to get Nico home. It always has been, and it always will be, an uphill battle. And as Jared mentioned, regardless of the outcome today, it won't change my plight, and it certainly won't change how hard I'm going to fight to get him back. You know, international parental child abduction is child abuse, and the reality is those people who are willing to perpetrate this action on children and the left behind families should be held accountable for their actions. I obviously never wanted it to come to this. I tried for years and years and years to come to an amicable resolution with not only my ex-wife, but with my ex-in-laws. And my pleadings have fallen on deaf ears. But that doesn't change the fact that I continue to love my son now as much as I always have, and I will continue to fight for him as long as it takes. He has the right to have a father in his life, and I have the right to raise my own son. It's a God-given right, it's a human right, and nobody has the right to take that away from me. I hope that the people listening today understand that this is not about a pound of flesh or vindication or, you know, trying to get revenge on anyone. This is really about holding people accountable who have done a horrific act, and the people out there need to know that this is a insidious and an overwhelmingly difficult challenge to overcome as a parent. And without the help of attorneys and the U.S. government and the State Department and you know, the help of the media getting this message out, it's unlikely that any child would ever come home, especially from Brazil. I thank you for your time. I do have to go have a meeting with the government. I appreciate everything that you guys are doing covering this story, and I'll be here hopefully after to answer any questions once this is over. Thank you.
Let me now introduce David Goldman. David, unfortunately, has some incredibly difficult and terrible experiences himself, having survived through this ordeal for more than 5 years when his son was abducted to Brazil. David thought it was very important for him to come down and to talk about what he experienced so that you all can understand what it's like to be a left-behind parent like Chris Brann. And let me now turn it over to David.
Good morning. There are several similarities with this case. Number one being it's in Brazil, where my son was abducted and held for nearly 6 years. It's an uphill battle, as Chris stated. The abductors, and they are abductors, these aren't custody cases, these are straight and clear abduction cases. They do need to be held accountable. There are treaties in place. There is the Hague Convention. There is the International Parental Child Abduction Prevention and Return Act. So our government and our countries do have laws to deter, prevent, and help return these abducted American children. Our country should be about keeping families together, not allowing abductors and the countries that are harboring these kidnapped, innocent, victim, vulnerable children with impunity. Our children need to be returned. They are American citizens. They were abducted. There are treaties. Let's bring them home. When these cases come into the media, the abductors often throw everything up in the air and hopefully something will stick. If they throw every allegation possibly that they can make up, someone somewhere they hope will believe them, and they will damage the reputation and the good nature of the victim, parent, and family. I experienced that as well as Chris has experienced that and continues to experience that. He's not the perpetrator, he's the victim. His son is the victim. And we need to make that clear. Everything has been adjudicated. All these allegations that the abductors are claiming have been adjudicated, and Chris is a victim as well as his son is a victim, and he needs to be returned. Our government, I implore our government and our State Department to become involved more and help this father be reunited with his abducted child. This case today, this hearing today, won't effectuate the return of Nico, but it will send a clear message that even if they are above the law in their own country, America does still have high standards of law, and we follow the law, and abductors will be punished. If there's any questions, please feel free to ask.
Let me just make one final comment before we open up to any questions that you might have. I do want to make a comment about all the allegations that have been thrown against Dr. Brann. It is important for you to understand, and especially because Marcella Guimaraes has tried to make them as salacious as possible, calling her husband a monster and all these terrible things, that, you know, it's exactly as David has said, that they have been trying for years to discredit Dr. Brann, to get him fired from his job, and to do a whole range of other things. It's important for everyone here to understand the following, that these claims that were being made by Marcella Guimaraes have been examined by literally close to a dozen courts, tribunals, and experts, and rejected by really all of them. You know, it began in Texas with the Texas court-appointed custody evaluator, the Texas court-appointed child advocate, then the Texas judge in the case, the Texas Court of Appeals. All four of those said that the domestic abuse allegations were false, and in fact the judge concluded they were false and made with malice. The family nanny who lived with them the entire marriage when they were together and on their same floor said there was no domestic abuse. Right? She said, I live with them. I never saw any evidence of abuse. She never told me about any abuse. I never saw any bruises. I never saw any 911 calls. I never saw anything at all. Yes, they had a volatile marriage. They yelled and screamed at each other, but I did not see anything. Right? Then when it came to the abduction to Brazil, you had the United States State Department determine that there was no justification for these allegations. You had in Brazil, the Brazilian Central Authority and the Brazilian Office of the Attorney General conclude that there was no basis for these allegations. And the Brazil Office of the Attorney General, in fact, joined Chris Brann in the Brazilian legal proceedings on his side, saying that the Hague Convention required the return of the child to the United States because there was no grave risk of harm. And, of course, in the most substantial way, as it relates to this specific case, the jury in this case heard the allegations of domestic abuse as an affirmative defense for the Guimaraeses, and they, too, rejected those claims as well. Dr. Brann has been evaluated by dozens of different courts, tribunals, and psychological experts, all of whom said he was an excellent father. And it's important to understand that a lot of the allegations that Marcella Guimaraes, some of the most salacious ones that she has made, are allegations she only made years after this whole situation began. While she was in Brazil, she made up a whole series of new allegations that she's now claiming. And yet, one might ask, why is it when she filed for divorce in Texas, she made no allegations of domestic abuse? Why is it that she didn't present these allegations to the Texas court, to the court-appointed custody evaluator or child advocate? And the answer is because, understandably, she's desperate for her parents to get off. And she's going to say anything and do anything to make that happen. So let me just leave it at that. David and I are available to answer any questions that you might have. Yeah, so the question is, what is the status of the case to return Nico to the United States? You know, the bottom line is that when a person has a bad marriage, the penalty for a bad marriage is divorce, not being cut off permanently from your child for the rest of your life. And the reality is that the situation for Chris Brann has only gotten worse since the arrest of the Guimaraeses. He's been almost totally cut off from his son. He's had at most about a half dozen calls, totaling about 1 hour of time with his son on Skype. The family has been poisoning the mind of Nico Brann against him. And despite court orders in Brazil that say that he's required to be able to get 2 half-hour Skype calls once a week, it hasn't happened, and the Brazilian courts are not prepared to follow through. Today, unfortunately, is not going to resolve the issue of Nico's abduction. There are still multiple appeals ahead. The Guimaraeses have argued in their filings to court today that, they can rely on the Hague Convention decision because it said that she could stay in Brazil. You know what? I mean, that to me is really ridiculous on its face. And I can tell you exactly why by pointing to David Goldman. Marcela Guimaraes won at the first level and the second level, so she won her case in the federal court in Brazil and then on first appeal. You know what? His wife won those same 2 cases. And Sean Goldman has been back in the United States since 2009. His case is the most famous case in the history of parental-child abductions. And he lost those first 2 cases and ultimately prevailed, and Sean Goldman was sent home. So the idea that they can rely on this decision when clearly his wife, who ultimately later passed away, couldn't rely on the decision from the same courts, belies the the flaws in their argumentation. Unfortunately, there is no easy pathway forward. The U.S. Department of Justice, I suspect, but I don't know, will likely pursue the extradition of Marcela Guimaraes to the United States, and that will obviously, have potential consequences in terms of a whole range of other things. But unfortunately, today is not the end of the story in any respect, and there will be no satisfaction today by Chris or anyone else if the Guimaraeses are held to account. That really isn't at all what matters here to Chris Brann. All that matters to him is getting his son back.
What is the timeline of the appeals in Brazil at this point?
Well, I mean, unfortunately, Brazil has been a persistent non-complier with the Hague Convention on the civil aspects of international parental child abduction. For more than a dozen years, the State Department has said they don't follow the law. The treaty itself envisions a return of a child within 6 weeks. It actually says that a child should be returned within 6 weeks. It's been 5 years and counting. Right.
And I might add that my son is still the only American child to be returned from Brazil by court order. The only one. We were hoping after the case and the media that it brought that Brazil would change its ways. We are at the same moment returning children to Brazil under the same treaty. It's a reciprocal treaty, freely and willfully signed by Brazil to honor it, and they're not honoring it. We can't prevent abductors all the time from doing bad things, but the countries should not be allowed to harbor these children.
But the short answer is we don't know how long it's going to be there are 2 more appeals left, potentially. But the problem is, even if you get to the Supreme Court and you win in the Supreme Court, you haven't won the case. We're used to a system of laws where if you win in the Supreme Court, that's the end of the story. Well, under the Brazilian legal system, any lawyer for either party can ask a clarifying question of any aspect of that judgment. And once you've asked a clarifying question, it can take months until the court will respond to clarify. But there are no limits on the number of clarifying questions you can ask. So literally, there's this other case of Devin Davenport, a man who has won 27 legal opinions in a row in Brazil to get his son back, going back a decade. He's won in the Supreme Court of Brazil, and 2.5, 3 years after he won in the Supreme Court, his son is still not back in the United States, right? There's no enforcement. So this is the tragic reality here. But again, ultimately what really matters here is, is getting Nico back, and that is the only thing that really matters to Chris Brann.
Is the maximum sentence, is that what Chris is?
I mean, Chris has said that that they should be held to account, and that the federal sentencing guidelines would suggest a sentence of 27 to 33 months, and there's no reason that in this case it should be any different than that. It's important to note that there have been 50 plus prosecutions for this kind of crime, and there are people who have gotten the maximum sentence who never even succeeded in abducting their kid. There are parents who tried to abduct their kids and were caught at the airport trying to leave the United States, and they received 3-year prison terms. And in this is a case of an ongoing crime. Let's not forget that. Carlos and Jemima Guimaraes have been in substantial ways throughout this case, as Chris will describe in his victim impact statement, directly and personally responsible for every aspect of Nico's abduction, from the beginning to the middle to the present. And they're continuing to finance their daughter being able to live in Brazil. You know, they claim that, that they can do nothing to impact their daughter's, decision making. Cutting her off would have a big impact on her decision making and would force her to reevaluate the situation. They're just not willing to do that. It's just not what they want to do. You know, and this is a couple that's been able, with total impunity, to get away with anything you can imagine in Brazil. And let me just give you one quick example of that. You know, early on in the case, the federal judge in the case in Brazil concluded that Cris was not a danger to his. This was the initial judgment, by the way, of the federal judge, who later changes her mind. But she said she had read all the psychological reports from the United States and concluded Cris wasn't a danger to himself or anyone else, and therefore Cris could have unsupervised visitation, right? And so Cris then went immediately with a clerk of the court to Carlos Jemima's house so that he could have unsupervised visitation. The doorman said that they didn't live there anymore. They then went to the school with the clerk of the court, and the claim was Nico doesn't go to school here anymore, right? And it was only 2 months later that the court ruled that this was inappropriate or improper, right? And by that point, amazingly, they moved back into their place in Brazil, and Nico is back enrolled at the school, right? And this is what Cris has been dealing with down in Brazil the entire time.
Were you guys surprised or disappointed that Marcelli refused to play ball, come back, talk, to return Nico in light of what her parents are facing?
Yeah, I mean, the question is what, were we surprised about Marcelli not wanting to bring her son back? Unfortunately, nothing has surprised me with Marcella Guimaraes in the way that she's approached this case. You know, I want to be clear again. The defense seems to think that this is a situation where Dr. Brann is on the prosecution team and he is prosecuting his ex-wife. You know, all Dr. Brann did, and it was multiple years in, 3 or 4 years in after having failed to get his son back, was lodge a complaint with the FBI. The United States is prosecuting this case, not Chris Brann. Dr. Brann has no control over the case or its outcome or its prosecution. You know, at the end of the day, all he can do is lodge a complaint, and it's the United States that's vindicating the rights of our country to prosecute people who have violated our laws. And that's really what's going on right now.
I think the defense of one of their filings had mentioned in the Hague Convention ruling that had found that there was domestic violence or supported their idea of that.
Yeah.
Is that correct or incorrect? Or
Sure. Well, what's interesting is that the defense has, seriously mischaracterized the federal court judgment in Brazil. It did indeed conclude that she had been a victim of domestic abuse, but in the entire judgment, the judge makes no reference to all of the decisions in Texas, no reference that they even existed, no reference to all the expert reports from Texas, no reference to the fact that the Brazilian Central Authority, the executive branch of Brazil, and the Office of the Attorney General rejected those very same abuses, right? Claims of abuse. And many of the claims of abuse that she was putting forward in Brazil were literally brand new allegations that she had never even made in Texas over more than a year of litigation. And the federal judge in Brazil didn't look at it. But the decision of the federal judge in Brazil was not that she could stay in Brazil because she was a victim of abuse. They said two things, actually. The judge said two things. One was that Nico was well settled in Brazil. And the second was that because she was a victim of abuse and she said she would not return to the United States, that therefore to send him back to the United States where he would only be in the care of his father would be psychologically damaging, right? And on the first argument, it's actually a flagrant violation of the treaty. The treaty says if you file within 1 year, the child must be returned unless the child would face a grave risk of harm. The well-settled defense, a court can only refuse to send a child back because the child is well-settled if the left-behind parent delayed more than a year in waiting to file the case. And at that point, a court can conclude that the child is well settled. And with respect to the alleged grave risk of harm, the grave risk of harm defense is not a grave risk of harm to the abductor. It's a grave risk of harm to the child. And the child, according to all the psychological reports, posed no risk of any kind from Chris Brann, and that ultimately is all that mattered. But the most important thing to say about the judgment in Brazil, it is not a final judgment. It cannot be relied on by anyone for anything of any kind. In the same way in the U.S. legal system, until you've appealed your case to the Supreme Court and had it rejected, you can't say the judgment's final. So the idea that you can rely on a judgment in Brazil that is still being appealed And especially when David Goldman lost the same 2 ways that Chris Brann did and then won, and his son is now home. The idea that you can conclude that you can rely on that judgment for anything, when in the most famous case in the world of parental child abduction, Sean Goldman, David Goldman lost those same 2 cases and then ended up winning. So the idea that you can say, well, I can stay in Brazil permanently and I can deprive my my child of access to his father on the basis of a legal opinion that isn't even final, again, is not an argument that has any grounding in Brazilian or international law.
Nicholas, 8?
9. Any other questions? Okay. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.